You are listening to Specifically for Seniors, a podcast designed for a vibrant and diverse senior community. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Barsh. Join me and a lineup of experts as we discuss a wide variety of topics that will empower, inform, entertain, and inspire as we celebrate the richness and wisdom of this incredible stage of life. This podcast is being recorded during the part of the year in which the holiest of Jewish holidays takes place. I felt it would be appropriate to take some time to remember those of us lost during the Holocaust, but a part of the Holocaust that many of us know little about. So I invited our guest today to talk about it. John Pollick is a lawyer in Illinois. He has written extensively about his maternal grandparents, Jewish immigrants from what is now Ukraine, and his father, an American GI wounded in France. In 2019, he traveled to Ukraine to make a film about the, quote, forgotten Holocaust, the estimated 2.4 million neglected and unburied shooting victims in Eastern Europe, including his grandparents' family. That film is beyond Babi Yar. Welcome to Specifically for Seniors, John.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Some of the listeners today to this podcast were shown in a film in a group setting at a senior living facility near Boston called Orchard Cove. Many of them wanted to see it again. Some missed it and asked when it would be shown again. And we'll do it here now. Would you introduce the film and we'll show it again?
I'm happy to. My background, which you went over briefly, includes my grandparents who were immigrants from Eastern Europe. They came late in the immigration here, and they were very much shtetl Jews. They lived in a small town. This is not uncommon. My grandfather had a junkyard. He was a junk dealer in a small town in Michigan. And being the only Jewish family there, they preserved their Yiddish shtetl culture pretty much intact. So this is what I grew up with. I thought it was normal. And I just had these wonderful grandparents. When I got older, I started exploring what happened to their families. It was something that was always in the air. I always knew it was there, that my grandparents' families had been shot and forgotten, but nobody talked about it. So, a lot of the people in the family just entirely forgot that we had relatives who were Holocaust victims. When I got older, I took an interest in it. I searched for decades for the mass grave in my grandmother's hometown. And in the course of doing so, I found out that there was this profound neglect of these shooting victims. We hear about the victims in the camps, and I have complete sympathy and empathy for them. But almost half of the Holocaust victims have been neglected. And when I found this out, I went to various officials of Jewish organizations and Holocaust organizations and educators and tried to get them to start teaching about this. They wouldn't do it, so I decided I'd go to Ukraine and make a film myself, which I did. And that's the background, and it's to show the reality of these victims, the reality of their neglected graves, the reality of neglected relatives, and also much more hopefully and inspirationally, things are starting to change in Ukraine. I mean, before the invasion, the 2022 invasion by Russia, Ukrainian attitudes towards Jews and Holocaust victims were changing, and there was this growing interest in not only these communities that had been lost, but in properly burying and remembering these victims. So there is a lot of hope, I think, in the film. I mean, it's a dark subject, but it's intended to be inspirational. It's a call to action. That's why I did it, because people have to start talking about it. Nothing will ever be done if this silence continues.
I never knew my grandparents. My 3 grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins were herded together with all the Jews of the village and taken to a pond amidst the fields. They were shot into the lake. I always wished I could find a picture of the grandmother for whose name I am named, Rachel.
In fact, there were thousands of mass shootings in Eastern Europe, primarily in Ukraine during the war, including mass shootings that occurred in the hometown of my grandmother and in the hometown of my grandfather. They were Yiddish-speaking, religious, very much out of Fiddler on the Roof. They were matched by a matchmaker when they were young. My grandmother left behind her family, her mother. She had 4 younger brothers who she had raised, various nieces and nephews. And when World War II broke out, she didn't hear anything from them. Eventually, a niece who survived wrote her a letter at the end of the war saying everyone had been killed. They were forced to dig a pit and they were shot into it. And that's all I ever knew until a few years ago.
Who were these people who ended up in the mass graves? These were kids. These were the children with happy, smiling faces, mischievous-looking kids. These were old people who have now raised a family, who were in retirement, or there was a woman who was a barber, another woman who's a scientist, or another one who's a pianist. Not all were accomplished. Variety of people, ordinary people, extraordinary people. These were all victims. These are all people who are in the mass graves.
So the image of people have in mind when they think of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, are the gates of Auschwitz. But there's another reality. About as many people died in a shooting process that took place in the very beginning of the war. This is what was the fate of nearly every Jewish person living east of the border in Ukraine, Belarus, parts of Russia. And that's a story that's not well understood, not well told, and gives rise to a very deep moral issue, one I think that will become a moral issue for our time, and that is the issue of mass graves.
For the killers, the perpetrators, the German unit in charge of the killings, the order was clear. It was to kill the Jews. But how to kill them, where to kill them, it was at the discretion and of the German units and also local administration. So this killing site could be many different kind of places. It could be a field, it could be a ravine like Babi Yar, it could be also a well. The killers were quite creative in finding places where they could perpetrate the crime.
In my grandmother's hometown, about 500 Jews were shot there, including my grandmother's mother, 3 of her younger brothers, and I think 11 nieces and nephews. Some of her family were shot elsewhere in Ukraine.
Whereas in the West it was deportations to death camps, concentration camps. In the East it was murder, face-to-face murder. So it's much more violent, much more intimate.
So all these crimes were perpetrated almost in front of the village. And despite of that, today we still, most of the people now don't know about that. And so how is it possible that crimes that were perpetrated 75 years ago in broad daylight are now almost unknown? So that was an obsession to kill all the Jews until the last one. So that's why you can find in one village a mass grave of 10,000 of people, in another one a mass grave of just one person.
In the ground are many Jewish bodies who have not been buried, broadly speaking, not memorialized. The graves are not protected, and there's an obligation. It's a primordial human obligation to bury the dead. It goes back to the earliest human times. So what do we do about it, and why has the issue been so sadly neglected?
And this makes it so traumatic, both for the people who remain now, who carry on the legacy of the victims, like myself, and the younger generation of Ukrainians who carry on the legacy of the 1% to 2% who were actively working with the Germans in carrying out the Holocaust in Ukraine. I'm here because my parents were helped by Ukrainians. And I never met my grandparents because other Ukrainians murdered my parents' parents. So it's a complicated story. It's a very intertwined story.
Mainly today, the focus of many people is on the bloody, difficult, tragic, horrible World War II periods. But the history goes back 2,000 years. The great majority of Ashkenazi Jews alive in the world today originate from the territory of what is today Ukraine. There was not a Ukrainian state until 1991. Soviet power did not recognize, did not want to recognize the Jewish element in the Shoah. But then Soviet Union went out of business in 1991. What was done since then? Not very much.
Only after collapse Soviet Union, Jewish topic, fate of Jews, Holocaust history. It's a we open opportunity for discuss in my country about this topic and teaching this topic. And a lot Ukrainian teachers start teach Holocaust as a part of World War II, teaching Holocaust as a part of Ukrainian history.
Ukraine is rebuilding. It's a young country with energetic, optimistic young people, but it requires that citizens of Ukraine, people living in villages and small places or big places, see the bodies in the ground as their co-citizens. Once you appreciate the scale, the reality and scale of the reality of the problem, you can't turn your back from it. It's morally indefensible.
The Holocaust began here in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, with these mass shootings. It showed the Nazis that the Holocaust was possible.
Germany undertook a major effort, as soon as the Soviet Union's disappearance enabled this, to gather virtually every shred of DNA of Germans who were engaged in war and killing in the East. And the families know where their family members lie, their well-tended cemeteries, and that's right. That's right. But that should also be done for the victims of those soldiers.
Yahad in Unum was created in 2004. It was created first to establish a better dialogue between Jews and Christians. And then came the main project, the so-called Holocaust by Bullets project, which consists in interviewing eyewitnesses of mass shooting of Jews all over the occupied Soviet territories and also in Central Europe, and to identify the mass graves of the victims. And what is surprising is that most of these people are very keen to speak. It's important for them to remember what happened to their Jewish neighbors. Once we interviewed them on the site, we conduct a ballistic expertise around the mass grave, trying to find the cartridges of the killers, so the German cartridges, and also the Jewish belongings. So once we know more or less, for instance, where the Jews were forced to get undressed, we look for belongings that could be jewels or shoes or pieces of clothes, and we find very often dreidel. What is always very moving, sometimes we find keys of houses, so it means that the people who were there and get undressed, they didn't know they will not come back. We said that we found the mass graves are about 1.5 million Jewish victims. But it means that we didn't find all of them because according to the estimation, more than 2 million of Jews were killed by shooting, were killed outside the death camps. So it's we need to find more 500,000 more victims.
And here is part of back, small bones from back. Originally, I was born in Kyiv, Ukraine. Holocaust archaeology, it is very specific and new field of research because, first of all, work on Holocaust sites don't allow to disturb human remains, and that's why we have to use non-invasive techniques, which meant scanning using electromagnetic waves, which find different features under surface, and allow don't disturb surface, but see what is underneath.
We have to scan the earth because we respect the Jewish law, the Holocaust. And if there are turbulences in the soil, which mean there is something, there are buried Jews, and then we mark place, and then of course we have to find an architectural solution to protect these desecrated, mostly desecrated or neglected mass graves. Most of them are plundered. There are lying bones or something like that, pieces of skulls and so on.
Ukraine has a lot of unknown mass graves and kill sites for not only Jewish people, but for another victims of Holocaust, and we have a lot of work here. In my work, it allows me to keep respect to killed, murdered people, shooted in terrible conditions, who didn't get correct remembrance during tens and tens years, and it is very important for Ukraine, I guess, because we just construct our own society. When we start our research, my colleagues and me see a lot of very, very passionate, very supportive people. They try to help. They try to their own story and their local story. That's why I believe we need more and more and more education, research, and people who can show and help how to use their knowledge and their respect to these people.
You see, there is a big interest in the topic, especially in the villages and small towns, because they see it now, or begin to see it as their own history. The Jewish history, the history of the Holocaust, as part of the national history of the Ukraine. And this is the first step to take it.
And it's the obligation of our generation to do something to make sure that these spaces are marked, protected, respected, and that people who died such humiliating deaths are given the opportunity for some respect.
Ukraine is a multicultural country. Jewish faith, one of faith of my country. And now it's a challenge, save Jewish heritage. Me and my colleagues, we investigated documents, archived documents, and published text about history, concrete place. And second, our responsibility, preparation local teachers. Teachers who finished our seminars, they disseminate knowledge to them colleagues. And really result exists. But we can speak about approximately 10,000 history teachers who finished our seminars which devoted Holocaust history.
As I talk to officials of Jewish organizations, American Jewish organizations, and American Holocaust museums, and tell them that they're not properly educating the American public, and especially the American Jewish public, about the extent of the mass shootings. Over 2 million were shot, and the just wretched state of these graves. They're unprotected. There are no markers at all at most of them. The Jews who have been murdered in these, across Ukraine and Eastern Europe, they were murdered because they were Jews. Therefore, the Jewish people have a responsibility to see that they're properly buried, that the sites are protected so they aren't vandalized, the sites are protected so that bones are not on the outside of the mass graves, and that some kind of dignified memorial is put up.
Мы сегодня собрались на этом скорбном месте, чтобы почтить память тех, кто лежит здесь и не сможет встать и рассказать о своей судьбе, о том, что они должны были пережить.
Вбивали всіх, старого і малого, і мало хто життя порятував.
Важко сьогодні говорити, тому що дійсно тут розстріляні десятки невинних людей. Ми сьогодні не можемо і не повинні сіяти чвари в суспільстві, ділити одне одного. Адже у нас одна Україна, одна історія, одна пам'ять і один біль.
There's so many speeches at these dedications, and they'll have the mayor get up, assistant mayor, dignitaries, and they'll speak in very moving terms, and I think very sincerely about their concern, about their sadness, about the murder of the Jewish people there, and they remember them with respect.
Das Projekt Protecting Memory im Jahre 2010 begonnen und im Jahr 2015 wurden 5 Gedenk- und Informationsorte im Westen ihres Landes eingeweiht.
At the ceremonies, students up to very, very old women, you've seen them. And this is for me very, very impressive how big the attention to these ceremonies is. The attendance of young children who read the names of the victims, who have researched the name of the victims, is something which gives me the hope of maintenance.
So the story is coming out. The younger generation should not feel the collective guilt. They are not responsible. They are not responsible for what some members of the older generation had done, and those people are long gone. They are responsible, however, for how things are remembered. That's all that they need to be responsible for, to be honest in accepting what the record tells us, and to use that opportunity to heal.
You know, it is very important to find solution how to live together, not looking for a difference, but find something what united us. And I think this type of memory place, I mean graves, not for Jews or for Romas or for prisoners of war, but for all Ukrainian people, it is very important because it is a physical place for paying respects.
Нові дослідження і педагогічно-освітня робота. Це по-справжньому. Це по-справжньому. Це те, що роблять в усьому світі. І повертають пам'ять про людей. Young people, they can explain to local community what happened. They can continue, they can save memory in future.
We want to give back to Jewish family their own history, their own story, to know what happened for their grandparents, what happened to their relatives, because we receive many requests of information, and so for us it's very important to give the opportunity and to the possibility to Jewish family to be able to come back and to say Kaddish and to know where their relatives are buried.
We owe it to them to do something and begin talking about the larger picture now. It's not going to happen, or it's going to happen very slowly, unless, I think especially American Jews, because so many of us are descended from Ukrainian Jews, we have to start talking about it. We have to start talking to officials of Holocaust museums and Jewish organizations to make sure that they are focusing on it. We have to start focusing on it.
It's a message that for next generation that you cannot, first of all, you cannot kill people because they are Jewish or Roma or whatever, but also it's also a message to say that even if it happened, you have to do something to commemorate the victims and to give back. Maybe it's easier for people to remember a crime when you have traces of crime. And the death camp, like Auschwitz, like Sobibor, like Treblinka, you have walls that remains. You have barracks. You have remains of gas chambers. And then you have all these mass graves out in the middle of nowhere, no traces. So that's, I would say that's a perfect scenario for a killer, for a genocider, because you just can kill people, bury them like animals, no traces, no one remember about them.
So this is why it's important that this be known, so we can show mankind, you Jewish people can show mankind, this is how we treat our dead. So we can show mass murderers or potential mass murderers. Look, if you do it, we're going to find these victims, okay? They aren't going to die and be forgotten as you want them to be. And I'm certain the Nazis wanted nothing more than for these shooting victims to be entirely forgotten. People need to come back to the fields and the forests and the ravines to show for ourselves and to show mankind that these victims will be found and these mass murderers will not get what they want, which is that these victims will be forgotten.
These sites are expression of something which happened 75 years ago. But it's a lasting memory. It's a lasting past, so to say. And to protect these sites and to make them into memorials is to honor the victims on one hand. It's an expression of responsibility of our both nations, of the Ukrainians and the Germans. And on the third, it is something which encourages Jewish people to tell their story.
So you deal with the past appropriately and to build a future. And Ukrainians, I think, merit being supported in building that future.
What do I see today that gives hope to the future? A great deal. I'm encouraged by the people that I meet. I'm encouraged by the people who are on this trip with us in the Protecting Memory, who have taken on work and interest in the most difficult of the topics, which is the mass murder of Jews right here in these places. These are very difficult stories to absorb, and it takes optimism, courage to take these stories into the next stage of understanding and comprehension, and the appreciation that this happened. We can't change the past. All we can change is how we remember the past.
Elie Wiesel, we all know him, and his book, Night. And there is a line in that book which is something like, to forget our dead is akin to killing them a second time. And there are millions of Jewish Holocaust victims who have been killed a second time. They've been forgotten. This project is called Protecting Memory. It's not protecting it because there's no memory anymore. They're completely forgotten. So it's really restoring memory and then protecting it. And to restore it, we have to build these memorials. We have to protect the sites, and we have to put up memorials. And then I think these people will be remembered and no longer be killed a second time.
When we talked about the film in our initial discussion, you mentioned that you advised that the film be viewed in a group setting before people watched it individually. Can you explain why?
I can. The film has been highly praised, but by many people. The difficulty is getting people to watch it, other people to watch it. There are many who have spoken very highly of the film, but they haven't passed it on to anyone. And there's, an understandable reluctance because it's a dark topic. And I've sent it to many, many individuals, and I would say commonly most don't look at it at all, or they look at it for a couple of minutes. Now, in a group setting, by contrast, I think if it's shown to a group, people will be more inclined to watch the entire film and share their thoughts on it with fellow viewers. And this is what I want to do. I want to start a conversation because the conversation has not existed. So that's why I think a group setting is better than just an individual watching, although sometimes individuals do watch by themselves and they get a powerful response and they're helpful. But I think a group setting is the best.
I've got to say that the audience sat through the entire film. No one left. There was absolute silence in the room while the film was being played. So it was watched, and It was understood.
Yeah. This is my goal.
What's your perspective on the film based on your educational background and correspondence with leaders in the field?
Well, my family was, for example, my father was in the infantry during the war. Being a combat soldier, a rifleman in Europe during World War II, he was 19 and 20. These are not the elite Americans, okay? My father had qualified for the Air Corps. You understand all this stuff. But he got stuck in the infantry. And the infantry, by design during World War II, was, to get the people with the fewest education, the lowest IQ, that kind of stuff. And so you don't hear a lot of stories from combat soldiers or from their children. On the other hand, my father came back from the war. It was actually there was a lot of good in it because of the GI Bill. And he went to college and law school. He became a trial attorney. And the war to him was, something in the past. But I found out when I was older that he would answer questions, okay? And so being curious, my background educationally is I have a history degree from Yale. I can't say that I learned a whole lot of history while I was there because I was young and didn't really understand. But I've always had this curiosity. And, I come from this family that was just battered by World War II, both on the combat side and the Holocaust side. And I decided I would use the skills I acquired in college, the skills I acquired in law school and in decades as a practicing lawyer to investigate this. I mean, this is basically the biggest case of my life. I'm the self-appointed advocate or lawyer for these millions of shooting victims who have been neglected. So this is my background. My grandparents, my grandmother was very close to her family. She just never talked about it. So I have to dig. I had an uncle who saved all the family records and pictures, and I worked with him and I tried to find it. But tried to find the mass grave, but mainly what I tried to do is to take all these family stories and tidbits and letters and weave it into the larger historical context. And once I did that, with respect to the shooting victims, I realized that although I had been led to believe, and I think virtually every Jewish American of Eastern European heritage thinks this. They think, well, yeah, there were shooting victims. Nothing can be done. Nobody knows. It was in the former Soviet Union. It's in Ukraine. It's in Eastern Europe. They hate Jews. And it's just, that's the way it is. Nothing will ever be done. As I dug further and further into this, I learned something can be done. But people must talk about it and pay attention to it. I think it's very doable to take care of these mass graves. I mean, there are hundreds or thousands of them, but it's been done for other victims of the war. For example, it's mentioned in the film that Germany went into the former Soviet Union once it collapsed, and access to these dead German soldiers they went in and they dug them up and they reburied them, and they're in very nice cemetery. Jewish people, unfortunately, have not done that, and it's time to do it, especially now because Ukraine is in the news. And if Ukraine is to become part of the West, which we all hope, Ukraine has to deal with these mass graves. They have to start talking about it. I don't expect Ukraine to pay for the protection and memorial. I expect Germany to pay for it, as it should. But Germany, they've done very little. They get credit for taking care, facing their past. They have not faced their past in Eastern Europe with these mass shootings and there's only been tokenism. As a matter of fact, the film is centered around these protecting memory dedications, which were just tremendously inspiring. And I'm so happy they were captured so well in the film. That project was funded and sponsored by Germany through its Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. Germany has cut off the funding. They have canceled that program. It's going in the wrong direction, Larry. So this is why we need to talk about it now. Ukraine is in the news. Jews are certainly in the news. Okay. Mass shootings are in the news. I think if American Jews had a greater knowledge and understanding of these mass shootings in Eastern Europe, we would have been more prepared, or we would have been greater advocates for ourselves in America. And maybe some of these protests which are happening and getting out of control would not have happened. Yeah. So I just think the timing is actually very good for all of these things. And I also think because, the people who watch the film and us, we're of the older generation. And I've been looking, I don't see anyone after me doing this. I don't know. And I don't say that to brag about myself. I say that as a very, very sad commentary on this whole situation. So I think now is the time to bring this to widespread public attention and finally have it addressed openly in whatever way. I mean, certainly my hope is they'll take care of these mass graves. And by the way, in the film it says 1.5 million Jews, it's estimated, were shot in Ukraine. That's the low figure. The higher figure is 2.1 million just in Ukraine. But this gives you an idea of the neglect of these people. I mean, the range in figures, it varies 40%. It's been 80 years. Nobody has tried to find out even the parameters of it. So one of the problems with the film, Larry, is, as you can imagine, is quite embarrassing to people who, run, the Holocaust museums and Jewish education. And this has been a problem. This is why I had to do everything on my own. And this is why I'm having some trouble getting traction. My theory is, there are different levels to present the film, but the level at which I hope most it is shown and appreciated is exactly what you're doing. I mean, people of our generation who lived with this pain, who lived with the silence. And because we need to speak up. And one of the reasons I'm speaking up at this time, not only because of my background, but I'm at that stage of life. I mean, we all are. We have to preserve, the memory of our relatives and really preserve the memory of Jews in Ukraine, because it's in danger of being completely wiped out. Notwithstanding that Zelensky is Jewish and the president, the Jewish culture there has just been. It's just been so suppressed and abused for so long. And now it's time to start saving it and treating it properly.
You did work with a number of groups to make the film.
Well, I did. I made the film because after literally years of correspondence with leaders of Jewish organizations and American Holocaust and educators and clergy, rabbis, journalists, nobody had any interest in it. And the reason for that is it's a difficult topic and people are embarrassed or uncomfortable if you bring it up. So in making the film, it was really pretty much entirely on my own. I found a filmmaker, wonderful guy, who is the son of a Auschwitz survivor, had made a film about that. And, he didn't know about the shooting victims. I mean, he was a highly regarded Holocaust filmmaker. And to his credit, he said, let's go do it. Okay. Because he feels that. So this was a key thing. Then he brought in a fantastic film editor. I just think the editing is great. By the way, the guy who edited it is an Irish guy from Montana who grew up on a farm. I mean, these are universal themes. And then, we found some young people to help with all the millions of things you have to do with the film, the permission, the license, the editing. So that's really how I did it. People in the film are insiders, but the people who made the film, like me, we're outsiders. And the insiders in the film are the very top people in the field. I think some of them didn't quite understand that this film would become so powerful, and now they're a little bit uncomfortable because they think it might embarrass their colleagues. So that's kind of the lay of the land. There are a lot of politics here. It's very disappointing to see politics around the Holocaust.
It's difficult to watch some of the politics in general now.
Yeah, that's true.
So the film was made in 2019. Mm-hmm. What's happened since then? Have more sites been found?
Well, with the, shortly after we filmed, and it's good we filmed when we did, the pandemic hit. Okay. And all sorts of things were restricted then, including, dealing with mass graves, even though it's been dealt with on a very small scale. And then, of course, in February of 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion, as they call it. And then pretty much you can't do anything. But so what progress has there been made since 2019? Not much. The Germany discontinued the Protecting Memory program, a giant step backwards. Searching for these sites has pretty much stopped. If there's anything to do with mass graves in Ukraine right now, it's searching for mass graves created by Russians after their invasion. I have seen reports of Russia hitting, in their bombardments and other attacks, hitting Holocaust sites. They hit Babi Yar, some shrapnel hit Babi Yar, but they've also hit other places. I don't know who's keeping track of that. I think someone should. Raise protests with Russia. So there's a lot to be done. But since 2019, not a lot.
So no more people have been named or identified?
Well, identified as victims?
No, identified as people with names, with families.
Not much. One of the terrible things about this is, although people, for example, who died at Auschwitz, Germany kept detailed lists. Their names are in the databases of Holocaust victims. The shooting victims in the East, and of course this happened, early in the war before the camp, they didn't keep records of them. And the estimate is that half of the shooting victims in Ukraine, nobody knows their names. Their names aren't in, the databases of Holocaust victims, for example, at Yad Vashem. And, if you can't even get their names, I mean, for Pete's sake, I mean, that's all you can do. So I, for example, after I came back from Ukraine in 2015, I attended with my daughter the dedication of a memorial in my grandmother's hometown. I looked at a family tree a wonderful uncle had prepared, and of 29 victims in the family, these are my grandparents, siblings, nieces, and nephews, and my grandmother's mother. only 11 of them were in the database at Yad Vashem, the victims. So I myself, and you can do this by yourself if you have the right information, and they do check these things. I entered 18 names. That was in 2018, including my grandmother's mother, my great grandmother. So these are the things that can be done without going to Ukraine. What it requires is us Jewish Americans of Eastern European to start looking into our past, find out what town they came from. If you don't know, find a ship manifest when they came. It will tell you. Talk to your relatives. And then once you know the name of the town that your ancestors came from, I'm very familiar with the research tools, and I can tell you exactly what happened. I can even tell you if there's been a memorial put up. So these are the types of, and then you can also check to see if names are in the Yad Vashem victims database. So there are things we can do without, dealing with the mass graves in Ukraine. Although ultimately, that must be dealt with. That must be dealt with.
It's a tough subject.
Well, it is. And let me tell you what I think the ultimate solution is. Germany has a commission called the German War Graves Commission. And they're German, soldiers from, I think it was formed around World War I. And it's institutionalized. It's funded, my understanding, part by the government, part through private donations. And they have hundreds, maybe thousands of volunteers who will go into Ukraine, let's say, and search for these relatives or these Germans who died over there. Now they encounter a lot of resistance, as you might imagine, but they've succeeded. And again, my understanding is about 1 million dead German soldiers have been, buried in proper cemeteries. So this is the way to do it. Is it has to be institutionalized. You can't, it can't be an individual initiative of a person in the United States, because you can't do these things individually as a person. You must have government cooperation. You must institutionalize it. And really what it takes is you need the cooperation of Ukraine. You need Germany to fund it and their cooperation. And you need really the United States, the American Jewish community here to really push it. Because, if American Jews want it done, it will be done. And this is why I think it's important that the film was made by an American, because it's up to us.
After the film was shown to the group at Orchard Cove, we got some comments and some questions. Let me play them for you one by one. There's 5 or 6, and maybe you'll comment on their questions and comments.
Sure, I'm happy to.
This was most revealing. For myself, I never gave thought to all the other killing fields, and it's staggering to learn that 1/3 of all the Holocaust victims were in these killing fields.
Well, that's absolutely true, Larry. I mean, it's like, the symbol of the Holocaust is Auschwitz. Auschwitz, I think the figure is 1.1 million Jews. So Auschwitz is not even the entire story of concentration or death camp victims. And, Babi Yar has now come to stand for the shooting victims. The estimates are maybe a total of 100,000 Jews were shot at Babi Yar. But this is compared to 2.4 million. So, Auschwitz may be 1/3 of the camp victims, but Babi Yar is more like, 4 or 5% of the shooting victims. So Babi Yar, it's a symbol, but it's it's in fact a tiny fraction of the shooting victims. And everyone, or I shouldn't say everyone, but many people treat Babi Yar is like the sole place where shooting took place, and it's not true. It's a tiny fraction, and the other 95% has basically been forgotten and ignored. And this gentleman here, I mean, you can see it in what he knows. He didn't know about this. It's just not taught.
And uncle were killed in Lithuania by the Einsatzgruppen, where they, with the mass shootings, also in 1941, preceded the camps. But that's how most of the Jews in Lithuania were killed too, by the Einsatzgruppen. They didn't wind up in camps.
And that's true. The countries of mass shootings were Ukraine, which was the largest, 1.5 million to 2.1. Lithuania, Belarus, the Baltic states, there were mass shootings there. And the way this happened historically is in 1939, let's call it the Hitler-Stalin Pact, okay? They divided up Poland. And the Soviet Union took the eastern part. And they occupied it for about 2 years. It was brutal. They imposed their Soviet brand of communism. And in June of 1941, Hitler, broke the pact and he invaded the Soviet-occupied area of Poland. And this is where most of the mass shootings occurred. This is where my grandparents' families lived. This woman who, the relatives in Lithuania, that was invaded in June of 41. And the first thing the Nazis did when they went into these formerly Soviet-occupied territories, and the Soviets fled, and the Jews were left defenseless. One of the first things the Nazis did is they rounded up Jews, and there were millions of them then. And they would put them in a camp. They might shoot them earlier. They might shoot them later. But eventually, what happened was they called it, the euphemism they used was they were liquidating the ghetto. And they would take them out. They would tell them some type of lie, like they were going to Palestine. This is typical of the Nazi lie. And they would take them to some pit, which had been pre-dug, or maybe they had the Jews dig the pit themselves, and they would shoot them into the pit, and that was it. And they would push dirt over them, and half of them were still alive. I mean, the brutality, it's just unimaginable. And then on top of it, you get the neglect by the Soviet Union, which didn't recognize them as Holocaust. And then the Soviet Union collapses, and nothing is done other than this French priest, who goes this heroic, who I know very well, by the way, who has found over 3,000 execution sites in Eastern Europe. I mean, mainly in Ukraine. So, what else can I say?
Let's take a look at another comment.
Sure.
Outside of the camps, we had a resident here at Orchard Cove who was one of the women that were involved in that march toward the end of the war, when Auschwitz was about to fall, when they emptied the Jews from there and marched them without winter clothes or anything else and marched them to nowhere. They marched and marched and marched until they dropped. And what was interesting is when I talked to this woman, what happened was that the Americans arrived in a tank with the identification that they were from the U.S. Army, and they were there, and the war was over, and they would be okay. Is there anything we could do for you? She was asked, and her response was, can we sit down?
Well, look, these these are all heartbreaking stories, and there were many Jews who were in concentration camps who died during these death marches, as you mentioned. Um, but the shooting victims, and they should be taken care of. There's no question they should be taken care of if these people can be, victims can be found, and the survivors, of course, should be taken care of. But in the East, with the mass shootings, it's just enormous. The situation we have here with millions of shooting victims and thousands of mass graves that are unprotected and plundered and unmemorialized. If my grandparents' families had died in Auschwitz, for example, rather than being shooting victims in Eastern, I'd have a decade of my life back. I would be people at Jewish organizations, and they would honor me. They would invite me to speak. But it's discrimination. I mean, we're relatives, shooting victims and their relatives. I would say it's worse than second-class citizens. I mean, it's like nothing. It's just other than tokenism at best. So yeah, I have tremendous sympathy. And as I said, the filmmaker Eli Adler, his father was a survivor of Auschwitz, a child survivor. And I've heard all sorts of stories, and I have tremendous sympathy and empathy.
And which groups of people believed it was true?
Very, very interesting question. I don't. That's one thing I don't know a lot about. There were warnings. Okay, there's a heroic guy named Jan Karski, who I think was a Polish diplomat, who learned of the mass shootings in the East and made it his mission, and it was a very dangerous mission, to alert others, especially the United States, including Franklin Roosevelt, of the mass shootings. So it's not that they were unknown. It's just that nobody did anything regarding the mass shootings. And then, of course, the mass shootings, the Germans decided that wasn't efficient enough, or it was tough on the shooters. And that's when they created the concentration camps. And the concentration camps, well, I don't know. I mean, people did know about them, certainly when they were liberated by, the Soviet and American forces, people knew about them. But the mass shootings in the East were not widely known even after the war, because these sites were in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union experience of World War II, as we know, was there were 20 million civilians who were killed. If 2.5 million Jews were among them, that's a small fraction of the 20 million. And the Soviet Union, they didn't create a special category for Jewish Holocaust victims. They were all referred to as peaceful Soviet citizens. And I've seen these, but you can go throughout Ukraine. There are memorials that were put up years ago, and they'll say 10,000 peaceful Soviet citizens, and that will be it. But in fact, it's 10,000 Jews, Jewish people from Ukraine. So the Soviet Union has tried to cover it up too. I mean, there's so many layers of neglect here and suppression that have to be overcome. But it's just a fantastic sign that there's this interest among the people at this residence for this, because this is exactly what we need. And then what should you do? I think they should contact the Holocaust Museum in Boston. I know you have a big one there. Or if you want to write a letter or a petition, I'll certainly help everyone do it. But my experience with Holocaust museums is they got their narrative down pat. It's Auschwitz and the camps, And shooting victims are, oh, the poor shooting victims. It's too bad. It's just too bad. Yeah, it's too bad. Nothing can be done. A lot can be done if people look and people want to do something. So again, that's why I made the film, not just to show the situation, but to show that something can be done.
I'm hoping this podcast is shared among families.
I certainly do too, Larry, because it's all about family, and you don't hear many family stories like this of shooting victims. And I can tell you exactly why from my own family, because nobody talks about it. My grandmother never mentioned it. And out of, respect for her, and we all had tremendous respect for her, nobody even brought it up. And this is how, memory is lost. This is how memory is lost.
Just a couple more that are important to hear as well.
Protected, but I'm wondering how the war in Ukraine now affects those areas. And are they still being protected, or has the war damaged them? Which would be extremely sad.
We talked a little about that, but
yeah, we did. It's a big issue. I don't know if anyone is monitoring it. It should be monitored. Occasionally I read or hear something about a execution site that has been, hit by a Russian bomb or something like that. So I really don't know. And again, nothing much can be done now, although we can share this with our family. We can dig into our family backgrounds and try to find out if we have relatives who might, be in these mass graves and get their names into the Yad Vashem victims database. But right now, it's, Ukraine's had so many tragedies, and this is the latest. In the film, I heard a clip earlier, the young Ukrainian forensic archaeologist. She's been in England for years now. She's basically in exile. And you can see in the film, she had such enthusiasm for building Ukraine. So look, there's a lot of sadness. I mean, Ukrainians, we all admire them, but in terms of joining the West and rebuilding, this must be dealt with. The mass graves must be talked about.
Just one final one now.
My own family was part of this scene. One of the family members did a lot of research and found scores of my family who were murdered in exactly this way. What I wanted to just say a couple of things, though. I guess it's a question, but also something I would want to add, that a little more historical context I think would be very helpful. What I'm thinking of in particular is that the way in which Ukraine was attacked by the Nazis came as a great surprise, because starting in 1938 or 39, there was a pact between Hitler and Stalin, a non-aggression pact. And the Soviets, again, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union at that time. The Soviets had they were taken completely by surprise when the Nazis crossed the border into Ukraine in June of 1941. The killing that took place at Babi Yar and in the surrounding areas, I think they were called Einsatzgruppen. Those were, I think, what we're seeing here, the most awful of which, or largest of which at least, was at Babi Yar. So just trying to take that into account, that people were in a state of shock at the invasion, they were completely overwhelmed, a kind of blitzkrieg operation. And so the Jews were caught in this way. That's the main thing I wanted to say, but I think to respect this idea of memorializing is terribly important.
Well, Larry, I did mention a little bit earlier the Hitler-Stalin Pact and how Nazi Germany broke it in June of 41 by invading the Soviet Union, which was really the first thing they invaded is what had been Eastern Poland. Okay. But no, that's absolutely correct. It was blitzkrieg. The Soviets weren't prepared for it. They fled immediately. It's interesting because a friend of mine, his father was one of the very few survivors of a mass shooting. And I was talking to him. He said the Soviets offered to take Jews with them when they fled. And not many Jews went with them. Some did. One of my grandmother's nieces went east and was a nurse. And that's how we know what happened to the family. But yeah, it was a blitzkrieg. The Soviets were completely unprepared, and the Jews were very, easy for the Nazis to round up. By the way, we talk about Einsatzgruppen. These were the specialized mobile German killing units, shooting units. But over 2 million Jews, or perhaps 2 million Jews, were shot in Ukraine. Einsatzgruppen, they couldn't do this by themselves. There were many, many, many Ukrainians who assisted the Germans in these mass shootings. And a lot of it was in northwest Ukraine, where my grandparents were from. And the story I heard of the mass shooting in my grandmother's hometown is it was done by a Ukrainian. These were the so-called Ukrainian nationalists. These are the people that, Putin says control Ukraine now, these Ukrainian nationalists who sided with the Nazis. I didn't see that when I was there. Ukrainians couldn't have been nicer to me. And you can see, Daria Cherkaska, who is the Ukrainian forensic archaeologist. What more can you ask for in terms of sympathy for these victims? So, Ukrainians, their heritage, in terms of assisting, it's a terrible heritage. But you got to move on, and I think most Ukrainians are ready to move on now. But they aren't going to do it if they aren't going to get, support from Germany to build these things. And frankly, I think diplomatic pressure from the United States to take care of it. So that's kind of what I think, is a situation and what can be done.
John, I know the film has its own website. Do you want to mention the URL for those who'd like to share it?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The name of the film is Beyond Babi Yar, Beyond Babiyar. The film website is called BeyondBabiYarMovie.com. But I think if you even type Beyond Babi Yar into Google, you'll get the website pretty quickly. It mentions that it's the film, and it gives background on the website as to why I did this. And you can also watch the film on it. And then there's other information regarding people in the film, a short biography of the interviewees, contact information for me. I'd love to hear from, your viewers, and, start discussing strategies to get this more widely known and get something done.
So how can they get in touch with you?
Well, my email address is, it's also on the website in contact, but it's John, John, F, as in Franklin, Pollick, Pollick, John F. Pollick at gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from people because it's all about working together.
John, thanks for bringing this to our attention. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I hope the podcast is shared among family, friends, and bring more attention to this problem. Thanks again for coming on.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it very much.
If you found this podcast interesting, fun, or helpful, tell your friends and family, and click on the follow or subscribe button. We'll let you know when new episodes are available. You've been listening to Specifically for Seniors. We'll talk more next time. Stay connected.